Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laik Siddiqui, the father of holophase. Episode 13b, Part 1. Imagine you and I are standing in a field at dusk. Not to study the grass, not to measure the wind, not to name the stars. None of that is allowed yet. We are standing there for one reason: to feel what it is like to face a world before we have the rights to call anything a world. Fireflies begin to glow. One light appears, then fades. Another appears over there. Another, closer. The lights do not arrive with labels. They do not arrive with coordinates. There is no grid drawn across the field. There is no clock hanging in the sky. There is not even a rule that says these flashes must be read as moments in time, because time is not permitted as a primitive here. And still, even in that deep simplicity, something unavoidable is already present. Something your mind cannot stop doing, even when it tries to be humble. You and I can tell, this glow is not that glow. This pattern is not that pattern. This repetition is not randomness. This difference is not sameness. That smallest permission, the permission for distinction, exists before every other word you will ever speak. That is where we begin. Welcome to episode 13b, the Pure Phi Language. We are not building cosmogenesis. We are not telling what happened. We are not importing any of the furniture of physics. Not particles, not fields, not spacetime, not laws, not dynamics. Not even the comforting idea that energy is some substance flowing through reality. Because you already carry the earlier truth. Energy is a tally, a report, a bookkeeping outcome that comes later, not a primitive thing. We are not doing any of that. We are freezing the alphabet so we cannot cheat later. And in this alphabet, there is exactly one letter we are allowed to touch at the language level. One token, one primitive. Not two, not three. One. I will name it Phi, but I need you to hear this carefully. Phi is not a thing. It is not a substance. It is not a glow in the field. It is not energy. It is not a field living inside a pre-existing spacetime container. Phi is something even more basic than all of that. It is the permission for anything to be publicly distinguishable at all. So here's the first and only ontic sentence we install in part 1, and we install it like a seal. Phi monon X and S1. That's it. If you feel a temptation to rush past that line, don't. This line is the first place people cheat, because the symbols look familiar. They look like a field. They look like physics. But in pure Phi language, those associations are dangerous. Here they mean something stricter. Phi is a mapping, a token that assigns, on some domain X, values that live on a circle S1. What is X? Not space-time, not the universe, not a container with geometry. X, for now, is only the minimal where of the sentence, the domain on which the token is declared. If I say, it is raining, you ask, where? That where is X. It is the support of discourse, the stage on which we later speak in patches, overlaps, neighborhoods, without importing metric structure. We will make X precise in part 2. For now, you simply hold. Phi is not floating. It must be declared over something. And what is S1? Not a wheel floating in space, not a spinning object. S1 is a type. It is the codomain that enforces a discipline. Phi values are cyclic. They live on a circle, meaning they wrap, meaning they identify, meaning there is no privileged beginning built into the structure. And that, right there, is why this primitive is so powerful. A circle gives you order without giving you an absolute origin. A circle gives you repeatability without giving you a preferred zero. A circle gives you closure without giving you an ultimate start point. This is the minimal structure that can later force integers without us inserting integers by hand. Let me make that intuitive in a way you can feel in your bones. Think of a rhythm. You can clap a cycle. Clap, clap, pause, clap, pause, pause. Then it repeats. The pattern has structure, it has order, but you can start listening at any point in the cycle and still recover the same rhythm. If someone insists, no, the universe has a true first clap, they have added a decoration, not discovered a necessity. The circle is the refusal of that decoration. Or think of the seasons. You can choose a day and declare it the start of the year, but the cycle does not care. The cycle continues. The circle is the mathematical form of that humility. It refuses to grant you a privileged beginning. Or think of a compass direction: north, east, south, west, and back to north. A compass has order, it has adjacency, but it does not come with a natural absolute zero baked into the world. You can choose north as special, and for navigation it's useful, but the circle itself does not demand it. Again, structure without an imposed origin. That is the kind of primitive phi is: a cyclic assignment on a declared domain, not an explanation of the universe, the permission that later explanations must presuppose. Now, because we are firewalled, we do not let ourselves speak in a way that sounds profound but is structurally sloppy. So here, in part 1, I embed the 4 gates as living habits, like the hygiene rules of a laboratory, except this is a laboratory of language. The first habit is well-formedness. What counts as a valid sentence? A sentence that uses phi must respect its type. Phi must be S1 valued. That seems simple, but it's where the whole project stands or collapses, because the easiest way to smuggle physics in early is to smuggle extra structure into the codomain. If you put a metric on the circle, you have imported a ruler. If you pick a preferred 0 point, you have imported absolute phase. If you sneak in a distinguished direction that cannot be reversed, you have imported an asymmetry you haven't earned. And if you treat phi as if it lives on the real line by default, like an ordinary number you can compare absolutely, you have abandoned the cyclic discipline that keeps us honest. So the first gate closes on this. Phi is bare cyclic order. No extra scaffolding. If a sentence treats phi as anything else, it is ill-formed. It doesn't matter how pretty it sounds. It doesn't enter the language. Now the second habit is invariance. What must not change when we redescribe? In ordinary life, you already live by this rule. A city does not change because you redraw the map. A melody does not change because you begin counting from a different beat. Water does not boil at a different reality because you measure temperature in Celsius instead of Fahrenheit. If the truth changes under a loud redescription, then you never had truth. You had a private convention. So in pure Phi language, our first invariance is the simplest. Shift phi by a constant. Phi for phi plus c. What does this mean? It means you choose a different zero around the circle, like rotating the clock face, like deciding that spring begins the year instead of winter, like starting your rhythm count on a different clap. If a statement depends on the absolute value of phi, if it needs a preferred zero, then that statement is not meaning. It is notation pretending to be reality. This is not a law of physics yet. We are not doing dynamics. This is a law of meaning. It is what makes public comparison possible. If meaning required absolute phi, then two observers who differ only by a shift c would be living in different universes by mere convention. Science would fracture into private dialects. So we install this as grammar. Any valid phi sentence must survive phi to phi plus c. Now the third habit is domain honesty. Where is the sentence meaningful? Every real claim, every claim that can be shared, declares its scope. You don't say this medicine works without specifying for whom and under what conditions. You don't say the road is closed without specifying which road. Domain is not a technicality. Domain is the difference between a statement and a fog. So in pure Phi language, you cannot speak about phi in general. You must declare the domain X, or at least the patch of X you are speaking about. Later, we will speak in covers and overlaps. But even now, in part 1, you carry this rule. There is no global universality without a declared domain. Floating sentences are silent sentences. And now the fourth habit, the drift killer, the non-encodability challenge. This is the razor that guards everything that comes after. Because the easiest way to ruin a foundational program is to add a second primitive the moment you feel uncomfortable. To say, okay, phi is nice, but surely we also need, and then to smuggle in time or space or matter or a metric or a connection or some new mystical ingredient. No. If someone proposes a new primitive, the burden is on them to prove that it cannot be expressed in the language that already exists, or in the language that will exist once we legitimately introduce later PS0 tokens like local lifts, derivatives, finite jets, and topological invariants. In other words, prove it cannot be encoded as phi structure. And notice the humility embedded in this. We are not saying nothing new can ever be needed. We are saying if something new is needed, it will be proven by non-encodability, not asserted by desire. Drift dies by proof, not by personality. That is the firewall. Now let me bring you back to the field for a moment, because you might be wondering, how can a single primitive letter possibly carry the weight of a universe? Here is the key. We are not asking a single letter to contain the universe as content. We are asking it to contain the rules of comparability that make any content publicly meaningful. Think of written language. The alphabet is tiny, a handful of letters. Yet from them you can write a treaty, a lullaby, a blueprint, a confession, a theorem. The alphabet does not contain the content. It contains the stable distinctions that make content encodable. Phi is like that. It is a minimal comparability token, and the circle is its discipline, cyclic order without absolutes. If you feel the depth of that, you begin to see why episode 13a insisted phi is irreducible. Any attempt to reduce comparability uses comparability. Any attempt to define before and after uses a distinction. Any attempt to define existence uses the distinction between is and is not. The ground is unavoidable. Now, I promised you triunity would stay alive throughout this part, even though we are only installing phi. So let's keep it alive in the correct way. Triunity is not 3 extra primitives. It is a rule about how readability unfolds once differentiation begins. When phi becomes readable as change, when later, on lift-valid domains, we can speak of the first derivative word, its expression will always echo in 3 inseparable readouts: omega, kappa, nu. Temporal cadence, spatial texture, kinematic transport. These are not separate things. They are not independent fields. They are projections, shadows, readouts of a single underlying change structure. Even now, while we have only phi, the promise is already active. Whatever becomes readable will not become readable in one dimension alone. There is no pure time without space and motion, no pure space without time and motion, no pure motion without time and space. That separation is a later approximation, a later projection, a later convenience. The root is unified. Here is a simple analogy that respects our constraints. Imagine a single rotating bicycle wheel, one motion. But depending on how you look, you can read it as cadence, how often a spoke passes a point. You can read it as texture, how the pattern distributes around the rim. You can read it as transport, how the wheel carries the bicycle forward. One motion, three readouts. You don't get to choose one as more real. You only get to choose one as easier to describe. Triunity is that discipline applied to the first readable change in holophase. We will not name the derivative object today as a primitive. We are not allowed. But we keep the law alive. When change becomes speakable, it will have three echoes inseparably. Now, let me show you how the firewall works in practice, using only language tests. Formal falsification in the grammatical sense, not experiments. Suppose someone says, I accept phi, but I want to add an absolute phase 0, a true mark on the circle. The universe must have a preferred starting point. Our response is immediate. First, well-formedness. You have added extra structure to S1. You have turned a bare circle into a circle with a crown. That is illegal in PS0. Second, invariance. Your meaning will change under phi to phi plus c. That breaks public comparability. Third, domain. Where is this privilege 0 defined? Globally? That would be a global universality claim you have not earned. Fourth, non-encodability. You must prove this new primitive cannot be reinterpreted later as gauge choice. You cannot, because a preferred 0 is exactly what gauge freedom forbids at the level of meaning. So the idea dies without drama. Not because we dislike it, because it fails the language. Now suppose someone says, fine, no preferred 0. But surely the circle has a real distance between points. Surely phase differences are absolute magnitudes. Again, we apply the same discipline. At PS0, S1 is a cyclic codomain, order, closure, identification, without imported measurement. If you give it a metric now, you have smuggled in a quantitative primitive. That belongs later, if it emerges as a tally or as a local artifact on lift-valid domains. At the root, we do not allow it. And this is where the earlier truth about energy becomes a quiet guardrail. When people try to install distance on the circle, they are often trying to install an energetic substance, something that grows with separation, something that becomes a resource. But energy is not ontic. Energy is a report. So we resist that temptation here. The circle is not an energetic reservoir. It is a comparability codomain. Now, what about time? You might have noticed something delicate in our opening with the fireflies. Your mind wants to say, one flash comes after another. But after is a time word. And time is not primitive here. So how can we speak honestly? We speak in the more primitive terms, distinguishability and comparability. Even if you do not yet have time, you can still speak of differences. You can still speak of relational ordering as an abstract comparability relation that later becomes readable as temporal cadence once change is defined. You do not need to import a cosmic clock. You only need the permission that such orderings can become meaningful in public once differentiation begins. That is why phi is the single primitive. It is the ground of comparability from which all later readouts arise. Now, I want to anchor you in what this part is claiming in the strictest sense, because later episodes will depend on it, and the listener must carry the correct burden. Part 1 does not claim, from phi we have already derived the universe. Part 1 claims something more foundational and more dangerous. We have declared the only primitive token permitted in the language, and we have declared the conditions under which it has meaning. And therefore, the prediction and falsification in Part 1 are grammatical. The prediction is, all later physical structure, whatever it becomes, must be expressible as constraints and invariants built from phi, once phi becomes readable through lawful tokens introduced later: local lifts, derivatives, finite jets, topology. In other words, the language will be sufficient as a vocabulary, and the falsifier is also grammatical. If someone exhibits a publicly distinguishable structure that cannot be encoded using the full Phi A vocabulary, phi plus its lawful derivative and topological grammar, then the language is incomplete. Not mysterious, not philosophically unsatisfying, but formally incomplete. There exists a non-encodable structure. That is the only way to break the single primitive discipline. And notice what that does to our future selves. It stops us from adding primitives by taste. It forces any extension to come with proof. This is why episode 13b exists. It is not entertainment. It is a safety device. Now, let me give you one more analogy, this time from biology, because it helps you feel the difference between a primitive alphabet and the content it later generates. Think of DNA. DNA is not a cell. DNA is not a muscle. DNA is not a mind. DNA is a code alphabet, 4 letters, capable of generating immense variety when read by systems that interpret it. But if you try to smuggle the cell into the primitive alphabet, you would not be explaining the cell, you would be assuming it. Phi is like the alphabet side. It is not the universe. It is the minimal comparability code that makes a universe describable once read. And the circle S1 is like a crucial constraint in that code. It forces closure, repeatability, and the possibility of integer structure later, without us inserting integers as a separate primitive. So now, at the end of part 1, what should you carry? Carry this sentence, not as a slogan, but as a discipline. Phi is the single primitive token of public comparability, a bare cyclic assignment, phi colon x to S1, whose meaning survives global shifts, whose sentences require declared domains, and whose monopoly can be broken only by proven non-encodability. And carry this too, because without it, the next episodes lose their spine. Even when we later speak of time, space, and motion, we will never treat them as separate primitives. They will be inseparable readouts of one underlying change structure once the language becomes readable as change. Now, the natural next step is unavoidable. Once we have written phi colon x to S1, the listener must not leave with a hidden assumption that x is spacetime. We must name x properly in the most minimal way: patches, overlaps, neighborhoods, without smuggling in geometry, clocks, or motion. So in part 2, you and I will install X as minimal event support. Not a container of physics, not an arena with rulers, but the smallest domain on which the Pure Phi language can honestly declare where its sentences live. Because we are not building the universe yet, we are building the language that will prevent us from lying about it. Always peace be upon you.